the news of a $1.5 million Super Mario 64, this seemed too ridiculous for me to ignore. I knew there had to be more to the story than meets the eye, and boy, was I not wrong. This rabbit hole is deep. The bubble we are seeing in video games has been seen before in other collectibles for almost half a century. And the crazy thing is that each time it happens, the same people are involved. They know exactly what they are doing, and they know how to extract as much money as possible from suckers who believe the headlines. There is a lot of shady stuff going on, and you won't believe what I found. This entire situation is fraught with unethical business practices, deception, collusion, and even fraud. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why this is happening, who is causing it to happen, and what needs to be done to stop it. I really hope you enjoy. Now, before we get into the specific details about how this entire racket works, there are some concepts that I want you to be familiar with so that you can better understand the context. The first is the difference between the intrinsic and extrinsic properties of an object and how they relate to perceived value. Intrinsic properties lie within the object itself. For example, if we were to examine a painting, the intrinsic properties would be the materials it was made of, and also, of course, how the painting actually looked. The extrinsic properties would be the relationship the artwork had with everything else, who it was painted by, when it was painted, the context in which it was painted, and how sought after the piece is, are all important qualities. When it comes to perceived value, it is the extrinsic qualities that objectively raise the cost significantly. Van Gogh paintings often sell for tens of millions of dollars. But if we were to program a robot to paint an identical piece...
I've been with the unit since I was born. I grew up on the battlefield. Conflict and victory were my parents. The unit... We've shared everything.
We are even willing to spend millions of dollars...
I have no one. Nothing except the unit.
In the 17th century, during the Dutch Golden Age, an event
nothing else matters to me.
Mania, where the price of tulip bulbs reached the same level. At the time, tulip bulbs were a luxury item that were highly desired for their intense colors, and as their popularity increased over the years...
Whoever you are, you're not stopping us.
Eventually, speculating means buying a good not due to need, but purely in the hopes that the price will increase so that you can sell it at a later date for profit. With investors beginning to flood the tulip market, this began a positive feedback loop, driving prices up even more. As the price increased faster, not wanting to miss out on the opportunity, even more people started buying in. This caused the first recorded speculative bubble in history, and there are two important things to know about these types of bubbles. First, no one buying actually wants tulips. They just hope to make money. And secondly, this process is not sustainable, and eventually people stop buying, and the price crashes. Those left holding tulips lose everything, their value. I want you to remember this process, because the exact same thing is happening with video games right now. But the difference is that the video game bubble isn't an accident. You see, if you know how speculative bubbles work, you can theoretically all you would have to do is raise the perceived price of a good quick enough so that speculators see the trend and start entering the market. Then, you can just sit back and let the positive feedback loop do the work. Profiting from your artificially created bubble by buying games early and selling later is rather obvious, but there are actually smarter ways to make money, ways that incur far less risk. In the current video game market and the collectible market in general, there are two institutions that stand to gain the most from increasing prices. Those are grading companies and auction houses. A grading company is a business that inspects games, certifies them, and gives them a rating of quality. They are basically quality assurance. They allow buyers to know exactly what they are getting, which enables quick and easy transactions. In a bubble, people are flocking to get their games graded in the hopes of profiting from the increasing prices. But it's not just the extra business that helps grading companies, as they also take a percentage of the market value of a game. A game for $1,000 might cost around $400 to have graded, but if that exact same game was valued at $1 million, it would cost over $20,000 to have graded, which is a pretty good deal. But the institution that really profits the most by far is auction houses. take Heritage Auctions, for example, which is where all of the
Arizona Bridge
record-breaking
checkpoint
video game
passed.
sales are taking place.
All
They
non-essential
charge a
personnel report to the
20%
holds in 10 minutes
buyer's
time for
premium
the scheduled
on
briefing
every
session with
sale.
the
So if you buy a
Commandant.
video game for $1 million,
You are
need
ordered to
pay the
continue
auction
manning your
house
post until that time.
$200,000 on top. And just for shits and giggles, they also take 5% from the seller as well. You can begin to see why grading companies and auction would really want prices to go up. It's in their interest. This is also why grading companies and auction houses should never be speculating on the price of goods or impacting markets directly. They have a huge conflict of interest. And whenever you see a grading company or an auction house talking about how valuable games are, you know it's because they want to drive prices up. Again, you'll need to keep all of this in mind. I'm going to provide you with a ton of information, and I'm going to trust you. If you are really details as we go, or watching sections. The two institutions that you will become familiar with are What a Games, the video game grading company, and Heritage Auctions, the auction house. What a Games was founded in 2017, but it didn't officially launch until April of 2018.
Okay.
What a Games is the linchpin behind this entire bubble, and the certification that Wata provides is the justification for why they are sold at such high prices. Interestingly, Wata wasn't the first video game grading company to exist. In fact, the Video Game Authority, aka VGA, has been grading games since 2008, but the introduction of VGA didn't cause a bubble like the introduction of What a Games did. And the reason is simple. VGA didn't manipulate the market or go out of their way to create a bubble. The same can't be said for Wata, however. The president and CEO of Wata Games is Dennis Kahn, and he is a key player. The other important company, Heritage Auctions, was founded in 1976 by Steve Ivey and Jim Halperin. Steve Ivey isn't very important to the story, but Jim, on the other hand, is critical. Heritage Auctions are in the business of selling rare collectibles and memorabilia. They sell coins, comics, art, anything you can collect that has value. And in 2019, they started selling video games. But not just any video games, only games that have been created through Wata Games. The interesting thing about the relationship between Wata and Heritage is that it seems to have existed before Wata began creating games. On the initial website of Wata, when it launched, it had a dealer spotlight section where it listed key relationships. One was Heritage Auctions, where it stated that Wata-certified video games will be featured in Heritage online auctions. This doesn't make sense. The entire point of certification is to guarantee authenticity and quality, but a guarantee is worthless if you haven't established a history of accurate work. Why would Heritage Auctions, a prestigious auction house, agree to sell games from a company that hadn't graded a single game? Why would they trust a business that hadn't even done any business to begin with, when there was already an existing grading company that had been grading games for 10 years? The only explanation to me is that Heritage Auctions was involved in some way in the creation of Wata Games, and knew that it was on board with their mutual goals. And if you needed any further evidence of this pre-existing relationship, Jim Halperin, the founder of Heritage Auctions, was listed on the Wata website as an advisor. Another business that Wata had a relationship upon creation was Just Press Play, a distributor of used video games which was founded by Zach Geig. Just Press Play also announced that it would be selling Wata-certified games. Now, in order to create a speculative bubble, you need a way to spread information very quickly. You need to draw in new eyes and make potential buyers aware that a market is building. The easiest way to achieve this by far is to create headline-worthy events that can disseminate through the media. In this case, it was the purchase of a Super Mario Bros. Cart for $100,000 in February of 2019. Before this sale, the previous most expensive video game ever sold went for $30,000. So this new sale was a pretty big deal, big enough to generate headlines. But the even more interesting thing is who bought this game. It was purchased by 3 men. The first was Jim Halperin, founder and chairman of Heritage Auctions. The second was Zach Geig, founder and owner of Just Press Play. The third was Richard Lecce, who has one of the largest video game collections on the planet. Heritage Auctions then issued a press release about the sale, because of course the purchase was never about collecting the game, it was about publicity. And if this wasn't obvious enough, Jim Halperin advertised in this press release that the game may end up in a future auction. Dennis Kahn, CEO of Wata Games, also chimed in, stating, quote, Wata certified video games have been selling for record prices ever since Heritage began auctioning them in January. While many video games sell regularly for 5 figures, breaking the 6-figure mark shows that the hobby's upward trajectory indicates no signs of slowing down. So what you have here is the chairman of the auction house buying a game for a record price and then creating a press release about his own purchase in which himself and the president of the grading company are stating that the value of games is going up. He then advertises that his own game will be going up for auction in the future through his own auction house. And his plan worked. The press immediately jumped on this, and many articles about the purchase were written. Kahn's tactic of pumping up the perceived value of games would be seen in every article. For example, in a Kotaku article, Kahn states, I've always said, video games are going to go the way of comics or cars or coins. It's only a matter of time until a video game sells for $1 million. In an Ars Technica article, both Kahn and Halperin were again pumping up the perceived value of games, with Halperin stating, there are bets on what will someday be the first $1 million game, and many collectors believe that this will be the one. It's so strange to me that news articles allow the owner of a game to advertise that its worth is 10 times what they paid for and not a single eyebrow is raised. They did everything they could to raise awareness about the sale. They even took the cart onto Pawn Stars, claiming it was worth $1 million. This appearance was the perfect opportunity to establish Wata Games as the authority in grading, despite having only existed less than 1/10 of the time that VGA had. Pawn Stars even had Dennis Kahn come on, and again he pumped up the value, implying that it was worth at least 3 times what they paid. Remember what I said about grading companies. They shouldn't be manipulating the market and driving up prices. Dennis even faced backlash about this from intelligent collectors, who knew what he was up to. But of course, this didn't stop him. He went on Pawn Stars multiple times, valuing games at insane prices. I can give you dozens of examples, but the point is that there was a very large, very effective campaign to establish Wata as the authority on video games despite having only been created. It was critical that Wata was seen as the be-all and end-all in video game grading, because then the words of its CEO, Dennis Kahn, would be more effective in increasing the value of games. Kahn would continue to abuse his authority as the head of Wata Games for the next few years, appearing in countless articles and interviews, and always pumping up the price. In fact, he's still doing it, even with the ridiculous price of $1.5 million that the recent Super Mario 64 went for in July. In a Verge article covering the record-breaking sale, Kahn states, I think that we are going to continue to see record-breaking sales. Again, this is purely to make people believe the price will continue to go up in order to fuel speculation. All of this press is driving up prices, but it's only one half of the equation. You also need people to actually buy games. But the people buying these games aren't who you'd expect. If you thought they were video game collectors hoping to complete their collection, you'd be wrong. Let's take a look at who is really buying up these games. Video game collecting has taken an interesting turn in the past few years. Over the last decade or so, I've been a big fan of watching collectors' videos on YouTube, where they proudly show off what they've amassed. In my experience, genuine collectors love showing off prized possessions, but that's not what we're seeing with these record-breaking sales. Nowadays, the buyers of these expensive games are hidden from the public. Identities are kept secret, and no one takes credit for anything. It's all really strange. Heritage auctions will never tell you who the buyers are, or even if money was actually exchanged. However, there are ways we can tell who bought some of the games, and this is where things get weird. Several weeks ago, I was investigating the relationship between Wata Games and Pawn Stars, given that the original appearance of Wata on that show was obvious collusion between the grading company, the auction house, and the show. In particular, I was researching the appearance of a Mike Tyson's Punch-Out that Dennis Kahn valued at $80,000. Through a Google search, I found something very interesting. It was a purchase agreement of the exact same cart. The owner of the cart, Brian, had sold it to a company for the exact same amount that Dennis had valued it at. The buyer was RSE Archive, LLC, which trades as Rally. Rally is a platform that allows investors to buy and sell equity shares in collectibles. To put it simply, people can buy a fraction of a video game, and if the price goes up, they can sell their slice to someone else in order to make a profit. It's essentially gambling on the price of collectibles, and it's as silly as it sounds. None of the people who buy equity in any of these collectibles actually own it. It's purely to try and make bets on the price and earn a quick buck. The purchase agreement I found for the Mike Tyson's Punch-Out was an SEC filing. Companies that hold these items and sell equity in them need to disclose their assets to the SEC, so we can track exactly what they buy and how much for. There are 3 fractional share companies that have sprung up in the past several years that are selling equity in video games: Mythic Markets, Otis, and Rally. Each of them was formed immediately following the launch of What Are Games. Through their SEC filings, I can track their purchases. Rally bought a Super Mario Bros. For $140,000 in 2020. This was the same card that would eventually be sold for $2 million just this month. From Heritage, they acquired this GoldenEye for $22,800, this Grand Theft Auto for $13,200, and this Donkey Kong for $38,400. Mythic Markets also bought this Metroid for $46,800. Otis also bought a Mike Tyson's Punch for $40,000. From Heritage, they bought a Pokemon Yellow for $78,000, this Gold for $18,000, and many other purchases. Aside from these fractional share companies, we can also see people buying games from Heritage and flip them on eBay. For example, a Super Mario that was bought for $84,000 in September of 2020 is now sitting on eBay with an asking price of $1.5 million. I haven't heard of a single legitimate collector buying any of these expensive games. It's entirely speculation, purely for profit. But there have been attempts to fool the public into believing that actual collectors are buying these games. And one of the biggest cheerleaders for this fake narrative is Eric Nyman. In 2019, a slew of articles sprung up about a video game collecting dentist who bought $1 million worth of video games. The original article was posted by the Washington Post. But if you know the real story, this article is insane. It describes Eric Nyman as one of the world's most avid video game collectors, but in reality, he had only been collecting for several months. He began only in 2019 at the beginning of this bubble. There are many people who have been collecting games their entire lives, but this man comes along and he's instantly the most avid collector in the entire world. The article claims that he bought the games, but this is also not true. He wasn't even using his own money. The money was put up by a group of investors, not by Eric Nyman. The article becomes even more suspicious when Dennis Kahn again rears his head to hype up the market. Heritage Auctions also shows up advertising that the market is increasing. Eric makes his intentions clear by stating his opinion that video games should be selling for millions, which of course would benefit him greatly after his purchase. So why is the Washington Post and many other news outlets touting Eric, who only entered the video game market in 2019, as the forefront of collecting? Why is it falsely stating that he bought the games when it was actually an investment hedge fund? Why are What Are Games and Heritage Auctions always there to give their opinion on the market? It's because this is not news, it's propaganda. Eric Nyman is part of the small group of people at the very top, building this bubble in an attempt to make money. He is a talking head with one purpose: to trick people into believing the video games he owns are worth millions, which he will then sell. He can be seen alongside people like Dennis Kahn, always attempting to inflate the market. And this isn't a secret. He admits his intentions freely.
It was that same week I discovered into video games, which I never knew that existed. And then when I played through in my head, I'm like, oh my god, this is like so much better than cards for me. I mean, also it's a new and emerging market. Like you guys are having an NFTs, it's that excitement of like, wow, it catches up a quarter of to where cards have gone. You know, we could see 100x returns just at the beginning, you know, because it was so new. But as a collectible investment, this is like everything that I saw on the Mike Trout card to the max on steroids. And for me, it was a time machine. It was literally like, if you could, like, I always said to myself, I would look at like Nat Turner's collection of cards on Instagram at that time, and I was like, wow, if only I could go back 10 years and just like hang out with him and just buy everything he was buying. You know, it's that thing that everyone has. You guys have with NFTs. It's always that if I could go back, I could be a billionaire, right? So I said, this is my moment that I'm going to go back in time, but it's going to be today, and I'm just going to go for it. So we set up, we spent time, we set up an LLC, we made a business plan, and I went to like just neighbors of mine, family, friends, all like successful, wealthy people. We spoke about all the risks and the benefits up front. They knew it was speculative, and I'm like, listen. But they all said the same thing. They're like, you seem super passionate about it. If I lose 15 grand on you, it's not the end of the world. Give it a run. Look to show even on heritage auctions, TV auctions. Look, what we spent appreciated 20 to 30%. This is working. I'm gonna get out there. I'm gonna help make the market. I'm gonna let people know about this. I'm forming a market around something that I feel that is severely underappreciated. So that's what I was doing.
My point is that it's not collectors that are buying any of these games. It's purely people with a lot of money, trying to scam other people out of theirs by manufacturing a bubble that otherwise shouldn't exist. Propaganda isn't their only weapon either. It gets much worse. We will now enter the wonderful world of shill bidding. When it comes to auctions, there is only one thing that will consistently drive up the sale price of goods, and that one thing is competition.
It's the enemy.
Obviously, if there is only one bidder, the price will never go up. You are not going to bid more if you already have the top bid. But if 2 or more people are duking it out, that's where the price can really shoot up. Shill bidding is the act of placing fake bids in the attempt to raise the price. Usually this is done in collusion with the seller, because the seller wants to make more money for the item they are selling, so they will work with a third party, who will keep placing fake bids up to an agreed price, at which point they will concede and let the victim win the item. But it isn't just sellers that have motive for this kind of practice. The auction house itself has just as much to gain from inflated sale prices. If your auction house sells goods at higher prices than your competitors, people will want to sell their items through your auctions. And this is where we come back to heritage auctions. In 2008, a lawsuit was filed against heritage auctions for shill bidding. It was filed by Gary Hendershot, who was a former employee. The lawsuit alleged that Heritage used a shill bidder by the name of N.P. Gresham to drive up prices. This lawsuit was ultimately settled out of court, so you may or may not want to put any real stock in it, but it is something to take notice of, especially when Jim Halperin, one of the defendants, and if you remember, one of the investors who bought the record-breaking Super Mario, was caught lying in a sworn testimony. He originally claimed that N.P. Gresham didn't exist at all, but later had to admit they in fact did. If it was only claim of shill bidding, I might be less inclined to believe it, but the story doesn't end there. While I was researching for one claim Pump, who is one of the most dedicated collectors of NES games there has ever been. He told me he was contacted by not only worked at their auction, but was also a friend.
Hi, my name is David.
What good are you?
My dad. He ended up taking a job with Heritage a couple of years ago, and he had a personal relationship with Jim, and they had a personal relationship for years. And that's how he got the job. Heritage was he worked for Heritage for years, and time Heritage conversation with Jim. My dad told me he was already talking and he told me, he's like, yeah, so they're manipulating the market. And my dad gave me an example. Jim was one of the biggest comic collectors in the world. He has one of the biggest collections. Just huge. And what Jim does, and this is what my dad said, he would take a comic book, let's say he would take this book, right? He put it in his collection, and then like 3-4 years later, he'd throw it up on Heritage, and he would manipulate the price by bidding it up. So say he bought the book for $3 grand for everybody. He throws it in a Heritage auction, and then he bid it up to say like $5 grand, $6 grand, buy it from himself, basically he bids it up, and then he sticks it away back in his collection. And then every couple of years later, 3, 4, 5 years later, whatever it is, makes its way back into the Heritage auction, does it again. And what that does is it stimulates the market by pushing it up, propping it up, higher than it is to show like, hey, there's been a sale of this comic book or video game for this price. So that means it must be worth that much. And that's kind of like what I'm feeling that they're doing with video games. They're propping them up super high, higher than they should be, to create a market, manipulate the market into thinking that these video games are actually worth this much because they have sales data to prove it.
If this is true, and everything I currently know about Jim Halperin leads me to believe it probably is, the tactic definitely works. When items are sold at higher prices, it raises the perceived value of every similar item. It's even more effective if you purchase items at record prices. Every time a video game sells higher than ever before, the internet is flooded with articles advertising your auction house. For over 2 years, all we ever heard about was all of the insane prices that games were going for on heritage auctions. Naturally, this makes people want to sell their games through heritage as opposed to anywhere else. But with all of the reports of shill bidding, reports of buying their own items, and the intense secrecy of purchases, we don't know if Heritage were involved in any of these record-breaking sales. This is why we also can't be sure of the recent $2 million purchase from Rally, as again, the ridiculous price, the secrecy, and the obvious motive make it very suspicious. The only major player that seems to use their own platform to personally benefit. It's time to take a closer look at this game. Are using their position for their shill bidding and buying your own items at inflated prices are pretty obvious ways to abuse your position at an auction house. But how could you take advantage of your own grading company? The first thing that comes to mind would be grading your own game. This presents a pretty clear conflict of interest, and even Wata admits this. In a New York Times article, Wata President Dennis Kahn goes on record to say that Wata employees are not allowed to have games graded by the company, or sell those that were. I'll say that again. Wata employees are not allowed to have games graded by the company, or sell those that were. This makes sense, and I applaud that rule if it's actually upheld. Now let's take a look at a transaction that occurred in 2019 between two gentlemen. The first is Dane Anderson. Dane is the founder of Nintendo Age, which hosted the largest community of retro video game collectors and enthusiasts on the internet. It also contained the most valuable database of information concerning retro games and what they were worth. If you wanted to know anything about collecting, this would be your first place to go. Dane was also well known for his video game collection, and he had one of the largest assortments of sealed Nintendo games on the planet. But in 2019, he sold his entire collection to a gentleman by the name of Jeff Meyer, who is the founder and CEO of GoCollect, which is a price guide for comic books. The purchase of Dane's collection by Jeff was a pretty big deal, one of the biggest in history. It was so noteworthy that Wata Games even gave the collection a special name. It was called the Carolina Collection, because both games held in Carolina. Jeff submitted the games to Wata, who graded them all, and as part of that grading, the collection, and you can see this name on the label of the graded games. Jeff then immediately took the newly graded games and started flipping them through auction houses, most notably Heritage Auctions, where the first auction alone produced a total return of over $500,000. So why am I telling you this? Well, it's because Jeff Meyer is a director of Wata Games. You won't find this information publicly because they keep it a secret, but thankfully the company's SEC filings tell us everything we need to know. According to their own filings, Jeff Meyer is a director of the company. So what you have is the president of Wata Games saying that employees are not allowed to grade or sell graded games, but meanwhile, a director of the company is grading his entire collection. But not just grading it in a special, privileged way by naming it, therefore increasing the value, and immediately selling them through auction houses at insane prices for profit. If the games in this collection were graded just like any other game, there would be nothing illegal about this. However, considering the fact that they were graded in a unique and special way, there is a very good argument to be made here for fraud, especially given that Jeff's relationship with Wata Games was never disclosed to the public. But it gets
requesting
even worse.
backup unit.
Jeff Meyer also purchased Nintendo Age, which, as I mentioned, was the most valuable database for retro video games. Jeff immediately shut it down. He also purchased the website Games Now, which is a price guide for video game sales. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but on the surface, it appears as though Jeff is trying to own and control troll the explore information about the value of video games, which only ends up being more suspicious given his ties to Wata Games. Again, another huge conflict of interest. Jeff has never publicly admitted to being a part of Wata Games, and the way he talks about his relationship with Wata makes it seem like that's intentional. For example, in a blog post he wrote himself about his upcoming video game price guide, Jeff states, "Thanks to the great relationships with the awesome folks at Wata Games." He is talking in the third person of the company that he is a director of. The cherry on top of all of this is that when Wata Games was incorporated in 2017, Dane Anderson was the executive officer. So this entire deal happened between two men that were or are directly involved with the company. Dennis Kahn obviously knows who the directors of his company are, so it really makes you think when he blogs about the Carolina collection on the Wata Games website, but fails to disclose
there a noise
that the
just now?
purchaser of the collection is a director. And it forces you to think even harder when you realize that at the very same time he is telling the New York Times that employees cannot grade or sell Wata-graded games. There is a good reason why grading your own games is a big conflict of interest, as the grade is extremely relevant when it comes to how much a game can be sold for. The higher the grade, the more valuable a game will be. There is no better example than the recent sale of Super Mario 64 for $1.5 million on Heritage Auctions. Its grade was a 9.8, with an A++ for the seal. It's essentially
Reporting
the
no
highest
problems
grading
in the
a
hall
game
on
could ever
B1
hope to
in the
achieve.
Shell 1
On
core.
the same day, another Super Mario 64 was auctioned with an 8.5 rating that sold for only $31,000. That's an increase of 5,000% for a slightly higher grading. This raises another interesting question. How reliable are these ratings? If you are going to spend an extra
Reporting no problems in the hall on
$1.5 million
B1
for a
in
high
the Shell
rating,
1
you'd
core.
want to be pretty damn sure that the rating is accurate. Grading companies attempt to make their grading process as objective as possible, but the truth is that they are very subjective by nature. At the end of the day, the grading is given by a human based on their own perception of the game's quality, and history has shown that this perception can vary wildly from person to person. Grading companies have been known to give very different grades for the exact same item, and this has led to a practice called regrading. If someone receives a grade for an item that they believe is not high enough, they will simply take it out of the case and send it back.
You have a lot of people playing what I call the crack-out game, meaning they get a comic book back, and it comes back CGC 9.6. They think it should be a 9.8. So they crack that baby open, and they keep sending it back to CGC, hoping that at some point, that grader is either
Who is that?
or that grader...
It's the enemy! I need to...
This is a 9.8.
Send backup. I have an unknown target here.
The overall marketplace for certain books, you go from a 9.6 to a 9.8, you just made a large chunk of money. The average collector, the average speculator, and the average investor out there is overvaluing a lot of these items based on the grade.
There's somebody
Not
there.
realizing that in certain instances, the grade is arbitrary. It is an estimation. It is not an exact science.
But you don't even need to regrade games in order to see the blatant inconsistency on display with Wata-graded games. Last month, a Tomb Raider for the Sega Saturn was sold for $12,000 through Heritage Auctions. It had a rating of 9.8 with an A+ for the seal, but it's immediately obvious that this grading makes no sense. The seal has multiple very large holes, which according to the grading system on Wata's own website is not allowed for A+ seals, which must contain no holes. The seal also has countless smaller holes, scratches, and stains. Quite frankly, it looks disgusting, and yet it gets an A+. I've seen seals with B grades that are better quality than this. My point is that video game grading is not a science, and the ratings given to games are not an exact representation of the game's quality, and yet the rating is touted as the sole justification for why people are spending an extra $1 million on some of these games. Now you understand why it is so important to establish Wata as the utmost authority on video games, because it makes their ratings all the more valuable. Now, one final thing before we move on. If you knew you were about to create a bubble surrounding sealed video games, what would you do? Personally, I would start buying as many sealed video games as I could. This is Mark Hasper, one of the founders of Wata Games and the current chief advisor. He has been involved in the comic book collecting scene for decades, but was never active in video game collecting. But right around the time that Wata was formed, he suddenly started showing up at video game conventions, buying as many sealed games as he could. Not only that, but he would actively seek out and inquire about sealed NES games. More specifically, the popular ones such as Mario, Metroid, Mega Man, Castlevania, and Zelda. The kind of games we see being sold now for record prices. And remember, this was several years ago. His taste in video games seemed to align perfectly with the same games that would bring the most profit several years later. One collector stated, Mark Haspel was buying sealed six-packs with a good friend of mine a year before Wata started grading games. Pat, the NES punk, also noticed Haspel collecting games at conventions.
In June 2019, I was a guest at a gaming convention. The weekend of the event, I noticed a small group of individuals who were hurriedly acquiring sealed and complete in-box games from vendors. At one point, I witnessed an individual who I later learned to be Mark Haspel returning to the Wata Expo booth while holding a stack of NES games. I did find it a little strange, but was unaware of any affiliation that person may have had with Wata, so I didn't think much of it at the time.
It's obviously not illegal for the founders of Wata Games to collect video games, and it's impossible to prove intent, but these examples just strengthen my opinion that they knew what was about to happen, and they were preparing for it. Now, before we get to the conclusion, I want to teach you about an event in history that might be relevant to what's happening right now. The great coin collecting bubble of the 80s. Believe it or not, this kind of crazy bubble surrounding a collectible has been seen before. Not to this extent, but still, this isn't a new thing. In the 80s, it wasn't video games, it was coins. PCGS is the world leader in coin grading, and on its website it tracks something called the PCGS 3000 Index. It's an index of the value of coins, similar to something like the Dow Jones. In the historical chart, you can see a massive spike occurring in the late 80s. After crashing, the price has still not recovered to levels seen 30 years ago, and this is without even considering inflation. So what caused this bubble? Well, according to an article posted on antiquesage.com, it was the development of slabbing and the introduction of third-party certification. Slabbing is where a grading company take a coin, paste it in plastic, and give it a rating.
Are you all right?
Grading companies were formed around this time, PCGS and NGC. The article goes on to state that the arrival of PCGS and NGC changed the industry nearly overnight. Now dealers, collectors, and investors could buy or sell slab coins. They all trusted the grades given by the major grading
what's going on?
services. If you're beginning to get a sense of deja vu, that's completely understandable. This is literally the exact same thing that's currently happening with video games. The fact that people could easily and confidently purchase graded coins meant that they began to sell more and more. This led to the price going up. Investors began to take notice, and more importantly, even investment hedge funds were involved. Kidder, Peabody & Co., Merrill Lynch, and UBS all created coin hedge funds where they took in money from investors to invest in coins. This expanded the bubble even further. But the thing about speculative bubbles is that they always burst. The price cannot go up forever, and at the slightest hint that the peak has been reached, everyone sells. The ironic thing to remember is that people who buy collectibles for money price starts to drop. Everyone attempts to liquidate their assets as soon as possible in order to not lose money. The market becomes flooded, but because no one is buying, the price gets destroyed. In the end, it's the suckers who came in late that lose their money. Merrill Lynch ended up paying back over $20 million to their investors. The FTC even stepped in to investigate what happened.
I'll let you go out in style!
In the Antiques Age article I read, it said that third-party coin trading company. But this is actually false. The first third-party coin trading company was Numismatic Certification Institute.
Right there, I'll take care of it.
The FTC
More ammo! Catch!
Times article written in 1999, so I want you to appreciate how amazingly relevant it is. The article reads, By and large, it's grading and rarity that determine the value of a coin. Rarity is easy enough to establish. Grading is often a matter
Colonel,
of opinion.
metal-
It's for this reason that grading services came into being. Their purpose is to give an impartial rating to a coin, which virtually establishes a particular price. But what happens if the grading service misrepresents the grade of a coin, thereby increasing its value? That's the situation described by Bill McAllister of the Washington Post in regards to a recent decision by the Federal Trade Commission. The commission determined that overgrading coins was a deceptive and unfair act, prohibited by the 1914 law that created the FTC. Charged with this practice were two Texas-based corporations, Heritage Capital Corp. And Numismatic Certification Institute. Also named in the action were Steve Ivey and James Halperin, prominent numismatic figures. A consent order was signed agreeing to establish a $1.2 million fund for collectors who purchased the NCI-graded coins from Coin Galleries Incorporated of Miami. Heritage, Halperin. Those names sound familiar. Yes, it's Heritage Auctions and Jim Halperin. In the 80s, they were found guilty of illegally misleading customers about the value of coins and fined $1.2 million. From the 1989 FTC annual report, it states, Numismatic Certification Institute and its principal Steve Ivey and James Halperin agreed to settle charges that its representation and failures to disclose information misled customers to the value of coins certified by the company. An affiliate, Heritage Capital Corporation, also agreed to settle charges that it provided substantial assistance to a coin retailer, Certified Rare Coin Galleries, knowing that CRCG was misrepresenting coins to investors. Under the settlement, defendants agreed to a permanent injunction, and Heritage and NCI agreed to contribute $1.2 million into a consumer redress plan for CRCG's customers. Another interesting thing about Jim is that in 1985, he wrote a book called How to Grade U.S. Coins, upon which the grading standards of the two leading third-party grading services PCGS and NGC were ultimately based. Again, these are the two grading companies that Antiques Age cited as the most important factors in the coin bubble. There is a very strong case to be made that Jim Halperin is the single most responsible person for the coin bubble of the 80s. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it kind of looks like he's doing exactly the same thing again 40 years later, but this time in video games. As I've said before, it's impossible to prove intent, but one thing you can certainly disprove is ignorance. Jim Halperin was extremely caught up in the 80s coin bubble and was so responsible that he was fined over $1 million. You don't forget something like that. He knows exactly how bubbles are formed. He's seen them before, which is why he will know exactly how to create them again. Remember, Jim Halperin bought the Super Mario Bros. Cart that sparked this entire game bubble. He is an advisor to Wata Games and, according to rumors, also an investor in the company. He is the founder of the auction house that these games have been selling on for record prices. It's too convenient that this one person is involved in every single piece of the puzzle when he has the kind of history that he has. This doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. The retro video game bubble cannot go on forever. At some point, it will burst. The question is when. There are a couple of scenarios that might make this happen sooner rather than later. The first is the release of population reports. In collecting, one of the things that drives up the price of an item is rarity. In every other realm of collecting, grading companies produce what are called population reports. These reports tell you exactly how many of any particular item have been graded by the company, along with their rating. So if I do a search for Action Comics #1 through CGC, a comic book grader, I can find out exactly how many are out there and at what rating. Population reports are standard practice because they allow people to judge the rarity of an item accurately and fairly before making purchases. But surprise, surprise, Wata Games keeps this information hidden from the public and refuses to let anyone know how many games of each type have been graded. So we really have no idea how many of each game are out there. When more games of the same kind become known,
I took these
prices
photos 2
plummet.
years ago.
It has already started happening with some games.
How
The
did you
best example is Spider-Man for the Atari 2600. In May of 2020, the first sealed Spider-Man was listed on Heritage Auctions. It was a 9.8 A++, the best rating you could get. It was mint condition, and it's such an old game that it's surely rare. It sold for $9,000, which in 2020 was actually still a decent amount of money to spend on a video game. But the funny thing about Spider-Man for the Atari 2600 is that it's not rare. It's not rare at all, even in mint condition. After this sale, Heritage was flooded with 9.8 A++ Spider-Mans. And when I say flooded, I really do mean flooded. With each sale, the price diminished. In April of 2021, a 9.8 A++ sold for $870. That's a decrease of over 90% in less than a single year. When people realize how common some of these games are, prices will be destroyed, and that's what What Games and Heritage Auctions are afraid of. Legitimate collectors have been complaining for the past 2 years, but unfortunately, none of them have substantial audiences, and they are essentially powerless against the forces that are driving this bubble. If you want to help make a positive change, you can send What Games some feedback by email, letting them know how appreciated it would be if they let us know how many graded games are out there. The release of population reports would be a good start, but What Games and Heritage Auctions also need to stop manipulating the market with their propaganda. Journalists don't even bother asking real collectors what they think about what's happening. They simply get sound bites from Wata and Heritage and allow them to inflate the bubble with hype, despite the obvious conflict of interest. I asked a couple of lifetime collectors what they think should happen, and this is what they had to say.
My name is Pat Contry. I'm a YouTuber, podcaster, but also a long-time video game collector since the late 90s. I've seen a lot of things in the game testing world. So what's happening?
Jack, what's going on? Answer me! Jack!
It's a shame.
Jack!
The video game collecting hobby that I've been a part of for decades, and many others, including this hobby of ours, with passion, with knowledge, doing research, putting in the time and effort. This is the end result. The unfortunate end result is that this hobby that we all love has been perverted. It's been twisted to the ends of a small group of people to line their pockets. These are rich people getting richer, and they've stepped on and stepped over all the video game collectors, all the people that have sold the games, who run video game shops, all the people on forums researching this illustrious and beautiful past history of video games. They've all been used. We've all been used now for these select few individuals to get richer, and it's a crying shame. It's probably too late, unfortunately, but in a perfect world, there should be full transparency and accountability when it comes to these video games. We should know if someone who helps run the auction house is involved in the buying and selling of the games that are being auctioned. We should know if the people grading the games are buying and selling these games themselves. It's unethical if they are doing so, and we should know that so we can stamp out bad behavior.
How can this be avoided? Well, it's quite simple. If WADA would release and update population reports for all these items that they're grading on a regular basis, this would not be a problem going forward, guys. This is a problem due to the fact that there is a lack of ethics and a lack of transparency in the markets. Collectors deserve that. You guys out there that want this to be a thing, rather than thinking from the standpoint that you're going to make money over the long term in this market, what you should be doing is demanding better. From grading companies, from auction companies, from other players in the trade, you should be demanding ethics and transparency.
This bubble isn't just affecting sealed video games at the highest price points. The selling point of every single game has increased dramatically over the past 2 years, even for non-sealed games. Aspiring video game collectors who legitimately want to build their collections will get screwed because the hobby will become too expensive to be viable. What's worse is that people are using the record sale prices in order to scam people. You can find cart-only Super Mario 64s for hundreds or even thousands of dollars on eBay when they are only worth $10. People with a lot of money money and power have taken over collecting, and their thirst for money means we will all suffer. As someone who does care deeply about gaming, it honestly sickens me that these people have turned these cherished possessions into a means to gamble and speculate. And I hope this ridiculous practice of trying to extract profit from the suckers who buy the hype will end sooner rather than later. As a sign of appreciation, it would be amazing if you could go and subscribe to a couple of real collectors that helped me learn more about this. Go check out PatTheNES.com and also Sean from Reserved Investments. These two gentlemen have been collecting for most of their lives, and we need more people like this who are not only passionate but are willing to tell the truth about what's happening. Also check out David Wilson's channel, as it really took some balls to be willing to let me know what he had heard. You can find the links to these channels in the description. Hopefully, you have learned something about how those in power can create speculative bubbles. Next time you see them trying to do it, make sure you call it out and let them know that we won't tolerate it. As always, thank you so much for watching, you legends. I hope you are having a fantastic day, and I will see you in the next video. Hello, you absolute legends. Doom 2. 30 levels of demon-slaying epicness. Technically, it's a sequel to Doom, one of the greatest and most influential games of all time. But those of us who have played it know that it's essentially the same game, just with a greater variety of enemies and, of course, twice the amount of shotgun barrels. We all know of Doom's importance when it comes to the evolution of speedrunning, being arguably the most impactful game ever released for the niche. And for my own part, I've taken deep dives into a few of Doom's most iconic records. These have been for individual level speedruns, which I would say is definitely what Doom is most known for. But what about speedruns of the entire game? Did they ever happen? And if so, why aren't they as well known? Interestingly, when it comes to ever released, full game speedruns never really perform, and the reason for this isn't exactly obvious. The problem is that Doom isn't really a full game per se, but rather a collection of episodes. An episode begins with the next one, everything just stops, and you are brought back to the title screen. Now, of course, you can just choose the next episode from here and keep going, but unfortunately, what couldn't keep going is the recording of the demo file. Once you reach the end of an episode, the demo just stops, and there is no way to resume it. You could start a new recording, but then you're left with multiple demo files with no way of confirming that they all belong to the same speedrun. Ultimately, this made the category essentially non-existent. Despite this limitation, there have indeed been full game runs, either using a real timer just like other games, or by using a modified version of the game. These runs, however, are much less popular and don't have the rich history you'd expect out of such a monumental game. Doom 2, being 30 consecutive levels, is where full game runs could finally thrive. Players could now record a single demo from the very start. Later. The conventional structure of Doom 2 is why it has over 25 years of full game speedrunning history, and it's this rich history that we will take a look
It's the
at
enemy,
today.
and you devil!
Various categories exist. The two most popular by far are ultra-violent speed and nightmare speed. Both of these categories offer some fantastic history, but today we will focus on ultra-violence speed. The goal is simply to get to the end of the game as quickly as possible with no restrictions, playing on the ultra-violence difficulty. As is generally the case with full game speedruns, it is the best of the best that stand at the very top, and Doom speedrunning is no exception. So sit back and relax as we explore the world record history of Doom 2. Now before we go on, a shout out to this video's sponsor, NordVPN, and I will quickly show you what I use NordVPN for. Last week was around that time of year where I needed to re-watch my favorite of all time, The Shawshank Redemption. But naturally, when I searched for it on Netflix, it wasn't there. Me being an absolute genius though, I knew exactly how to solve this problem. I just did a quick search to see which countries it was available in, changed my location through NordVPN, and voila, there it is in all its glory. For just a few extra dollars a month, I'm getting access to around 4 times the amount of movies and TV shows I could normally watch. That is incredible value. I don't save money because I don't need to waste a fortune buying 10 different streaming services. And of course, I still get all of the other features NordVPN is known for, like extra security and privacy. NordVPN even has a money-back guarantee, so if you're not happy for whatever reason, just let them know. Go to NordVPN to start using NordVPN today. Technically, the oldest record we have of a Doom 2 full game is a 57-minute and 13-second demo by the player Uwe Gerlich. This dates all the way back to 1995. We won't delve too deeply into this particular demo though, and if you check the current archive, you will notice a question mark next to the entry. When expanded, it reads, Dubious Demo, Player History of Cheating. Uwe and his close friend Stefan Winterfeld are somewhat notoriously known in the Doom community for their abuse of tools like slow motion. Sometimes it's really not possible to definitively show tools were used, but experts seem to agree that this first run likely did use some kind of illegal tool. One thing I will point out though is something in the attached text file. Uwe states, there doesn't exist a Doom honorific title for such a recording, but I think Doom 2 Terminator would suit me fine. Way back in Doom's history in May of 1994, even before speedrunning, a programmer by the name of Frank Staiano created a website called Doom Honorific Titles. This was a fun, casual way for players to show off their skills by completing certain challenges. They would submit their demo files, which were called exams, and if they were successfully verified, would be awarded a title. A couple of examples were Tyson, which was awarded after completing levels on Ultraviolence with 100% kills using only the pistol, fist, or chainsaw. Another title was Pacifist, which was earned after completing levels on Ultraviolence without harming monsters. If you already have some knowledge of Doom speedrunning, these titles would sound familiar. They are actually speedrunning categories that were adopted over from Doom honorific titles and are still used today. Now going back to Doom 2 speedrunning, the first universally accepted demo comes from Demon Lord. Demon Lord was one of the most politically impactful runners of the 90s, submitting hundreds of demos and cutting swaths of time from existing records. If you click the video on the Chasm, this is the very same Demon Lord that learned to love those ledges. On the 19th of November 1995, he submitted a full game 1 hour, 10 minutes, and 2 seconds. The run was simple, and it's obvious that mere survival through the entire game was the priority, rather than trying to be blisteringly fast. Nowadays, a top player may even consider this to be somewhat of a casual playthrough, but back then, it would have been pretty intense. Over the next year, Demon Lord spearheaded this category, lowering the record multiple times. He eventually landed on a run of 36 minutes and 9 seconds on the 24th of September 1996. It's here that we begin to see glimpses of the type of speedrunning we might see today. On map 20, he begins by immediately jumping into the lava and executing a wall run to quickly reach a teleportal, a technique that is literally used in the current world record. Still, most levels are played in a standard fashion with very little skips or exploits used. Despite many levels being obviously far from optimal, even with these strategies used, Demon Lord felt that he wouldn't be able to go much lower. He concluded his attached notes by saying, "This is probably my last 30 UV recording. I don't think it's possible to push it much more without cheating." This was right around the time Uwe Gerlich and Stefan Winterfeld were being exposed for using slow motion, so the cheating remark was likely a direct reference to that entire situation. In any case, it turns out Demon Lord believed what he said. Despite going on to do incredible work elsewhere for the next few years, this would be the last submission in this category he would ever complete. Evidently, Demon Lord's run wasn't terrible, as it would take almost 3 years before anyone would touch it. The late 90s saw a slew of incredible gamers see their way into the Doom speedrunning scene. One that was particularly impactful was a Hungarian man by the name of Adam Hedgy. Not only was Adam one of the greatest Doom players of all time, but he also maintained the primary Doom speedrunning demo hosting Cat N from 1998 to 2005. The history of Cat N, we are going to delve a bit deeper into this topic a bit later in the video. On the 5th of March 1999, Adam Hedgie obliterated Demon Lord's existing record by over 5 minutes, with a run of 30 minutes and 54 seconds. Adam was the first person to really start introducing very precise jumps into the run, a perfect example being map 6, where he was able to successfully perform 2 jumps that shaved off a lot of time. The first was a lift jump to make it to the blue keycard, something that Demon Lord had attempted but failed. And the second was a tight jump to the yellow keycard door leading to the exit, which skips having to activate and wait for a platform to rise. Another amazing player that came into the Doom scene in the late 90s was the Norwegian Henning Skogstø. Henning is most known for his prowess in the Nightmare category, where he was dominant for many years. On the 13th of June 1999, he dethroned Hedgie's run with a time of 29 minutes and 54 seconds. Strategic decisions that were made solely in the interest of survivability are beginning to be previously take a detour to collect Mega Armor, Invisibility, and the Megasphere. Henning skipped this completely, and even included a jump to the window next to the blue keycard door as well. More sequence breaks were beginning to be incorporated, like the red basket on map 14. Using this one jump alone, Henning was able to gain over 20 seconds on the previous record. The interesting thing about many of these jumps is that they were discovered years earlier, most in 1996. But Doom was still such a brutal game that many of the known exploits were still unused in full game runs in order to preserve consistency. Henning's record would remain unbroken for over 3 years until the American runner Vile destroyed it with a 26-minute and 57-second run on the 6th of December 2002. Like Henning, Vile was also a nightmare specialist. In fact, between the years 1999 and 2015,
it's been a while, hasn't
only
it?
2 players held
Jack
the
the
full game
Ripper.
nightmare speed record: Henning Skogstø and Vile. Joining in the early 2000s,
You know
Vile
this
had one
fellow?
of the longest careers in Doom history.
You remember
and still
me, don't
submits
you?
Insane demos
You've
to this very
grown.
day. Again, with Vile's new run, more sacrifices were made.
High
in regards to
concentration of
safety.
cerebral
Even though Doom
implants.
2 consisted
Have they
of 30
altered
main
your
levels,
memory,
players
too?
were still going through levels 31 and 32, the 2 secret Wolfenstein levels. An argument for speed could have been made at the time for going through level 31, as reaching the secret exit on map 15 and then going through map 31 was actually faster than completing map 15 normally. But one such argument could certainly not be made for map 32, as it was definitely quicker to reach the normal exit on map 31 and go back to map 16. In fact, the only reason players were playing map 32 at all
Olga,
was just
you
to
can't
stock
keep
up
this
on
up.
health
They're
and
bound to
armor.
find you.
Vile chose
Listen,
to skip
I'll
the
free
health
you in a
contained on
little
map
while.
32 and
Brace
instead pick
yourself.
up an invulnerability sphere on the next level. Aside from this, movement was getting much better, and more individual level strategies were being implemented, or at least attempted. Vile's record would remain strong for an entire year, until it was edged out by the Czech runner Radek Peka. On the 28th of December 2003, he would submit a run of 26 minutes and 9 seconds. Radek would be the first person to implement the Archvile trick on map 27. In order to reach the exit portal, you need to attain the red key. In order to reach the red key, you need the blue key. And to get the blue key, you need the yellow key. So ultimately, you need to collect all 3 keys. But you can skip everything if you can manipulate an Archvile into opening the final door. Again, this was another trick that had been discovered at least 7 years prior by the player Laszlo Magori. But as time goes on and speedruns become more optimized, players are left with no choice
there
but to
somebody
bring in
there?
strategies that might not be 100% consistent. Radek's run would last a long time. It would be the longest lasting record in the category's history, standing for 2,234 days, just shy of 7 years. Was this because the run was so impressive that no one else could touch it? Was it really that optimal? Well, not really. Long-lasting records around this time weren't uncommon at all. Quite frankly, speedrunning in general was going through the most inactive period ever, a time that players would refer to as the Dark Age. In order to understand why Doom was going through its most dormant phase, we must understand the context in which Doom's speedrunning came into existence. As previously mentioned, the website that maintained all of the speedrunning demos for the original Doom games was Compet N. It was created in November of 1994 by Simon Widlake. Compet-N was an abbreviation of the word competition, and the community instantly grew in popularity, with many demos being submitted. In 1997, the reins were handed over to Istvan Pataki, who maintained the site until 1998, at which time Adam Hedgie gained control. Something else very important happened in 1998, the release of the operating system Windows 98. This was the final release of Windows that could allow users to root into MS-DOS mode, which is where many Doom speedrunners launched their game from. Beyond this, when Windows 2000 was released and the operating system switched over to the NT architecture, DOS compatibility was lost entirely. Newer operating systems came with DOS virtual machines and certainly were not able to run Doom well. Players that upgraded to newer systems were essentially screwed, and unless they kept their old computers, they had no way to compete. There were other ways of playing Doom though, and that's one of the reasons that source ports became so widespread. As Doom's source code was released and easily accessible, programmers were able to port the game to any operating system they wished, including the newest iterations of Windows. So source ports were an easy way to solve the problem of playing Doom on modern systems. But there was a problem when it came to Doom speedrunning. The demo website Compet-N didn't allow the use of source ports for competition. Its rules section proudly proclaims, Compet-N is vanilla only, and will stay that way. Vanilla Doom means running Doom straight from the original executable, which requires DOS. Some relief came in 2002 with the creation of DOSBox, a much better emulation of DOS, but it was still just that, an emulation, and not a perfect one. For casual players, the difference was likely too small to notice, but speedrunners definitely noticed some issues like input lag and decreased mouse precision. As the years progressed and fewer people had access to operating systems based on the DOS platform, the amount of runners submitting demos to Compet-N dwindled dramatically. Then, in 2005, Adam Hedgie, the man who had been maintaining the official website for the past 7 years, disappeared. Compet-N, one of the most active and influential websites in the early days of speedrunning, all but died, and never fully recovered. A cautionary tale about the trappings of being too rigid with rules and traditions. With more and more people now using source ports, players were growing desperate for a place to submit their new demos. In October of 2000, a Doom World admin called Opulent created the Doomed Speed Demos Archive.
What are you thinking?
A Quake iteration of the same name. Doomed SDA didn't accept demos for the original Doom games, but rather player-created patches of the game called PWODs. These PWODs are basically fan-created mods of the game with custom levels. Doomed SDA was very important though, because it accepted demos from source ports, and ultimately ended up hosting thousands upon thousands of demos for almost 1,000 separate WODs. The website itself though was very primitive. Not only was it hard to navigate, but updating it was all done manually, and the workload eventually became too much. In 2006, when Opulent expressed his desire to cease his duties in updating the demo archive, the programmer Andy Oliveira took it upon himself to redesign the archive from the ground up, introducing a more dynamic, database-generated website. After creating the infrastructure in around 6 months, he then had the task of bringing across all of the existing demos. Due to the sheer number, this was a monstrous task that ended up taking 18 months. Finally, in November of 2008, the group revived the Doom Speed Demos Archive online. The website was vastly improved. It retained the mission of accepting demos. Best of all, it now accepted and maintained demos for the officially licensed Doom games. With this Doom speedrunning, its popularity was finally able to grow. The most notable example being a rocket jump on map 7. The exit switch is located on a platform that is raised and unreachable. This platform only lowers once all of the Mancubi and Arachnotrons have been killed, but with a very precise damage boost, you can jump to the platform, skipping every single enemy. The origin of this particular sequence break stems back to 1997. The two players Thomas Pilger and Patrick von Massow achieving a time of 6 seconds. Help from another speedrunner, the Shiva. While the level was slower, it was created in the pursuit of completing the level without in other words, but at the very least, the position of the ball is always the same, so a reasonable setup can be attained. When Luke used it in his full game run, he saved 40 seconds over the
It came as a
record,
complete
with this
surprise
one
when
trick
Ocelot
alone.
discovered
On
the
top of rocket
S3
jumps,
data from
squeeze glides
GW.
were being introduced as
Not
well.
a bad idea,
Squeeze
though.
glides are movement through gaps that
Using
are the
fire
exact
to
same
fight
width
fire,
as the
creating the
blade,
perfect
which
assassin to
technically shouldn't be
retire
possible,
Solid
but in practice,
Snake's
it
brother.
can be done. Like many other tricks, these have
S3
been
stands
known
for
years as well,
Solid
but
Snake
consistent
Simulation.
setups were still lagging behind.
It's a development
These
program
glides
to
allow
artificially
players to skip
reproduce
keys or large
Solid
sections of
Snake,
level.
the perfect
With
warrior.
the addition of so many modern
The
strategies,
result is a
Looper's run was
Foxhound
huge leap
Commando.
from previous
When Foxhound
demos,
no
and it
longer
would remain the
exists,
record
a
for
simulated
almost 4
Solid
years.
Snake shaped
But
by
in
VR
2014,
regimen. Sound
a
like
behemoth
someone you know,
began to stir.
Jack?
Doom players across the globe.
I'm sorry
felt
to
a
see you
great
reduced
disturbance
to one of the
force.
Patriots'
The
puppets.
Norwegian gamer Zero Master
But I've
was
made
entering the
use of
scene,
you,
and on the
and their
16th
plan,
of November
too.
2014 would beat
Solid
Looper's
Snake's
record
sudden
with a
appearance,
time of
your
23 minutes
arrival.
and 3
It was
seconds.
obvious the
At
Patriots
this
were
early
among
stage
my
of his
ranks.
career, Zero Master's
I had to
movement
smoke out
wasn't
the
anywhere
agent
near
before
as
the mission
mechanical
entered the
as
final
Looper's.
phase.
But what
You
he
came
excelled
in
at
handy
was finding consistent
as
ways
bait.
to execute strategies that were previously too unreliable to even consider.
Those days during the Civil
especially when it
War
came
were as
to
real as
squeeze
they
glides.
come.
Zero Master
Every
developed
day
much
was
more reliable
absolute.
setups to perform
Split
glides,
between
and
life
he was
and
able
death.
to then use them in full game runs.
You ran from it,
Performing glides
and
quickly
now
is
you've been led
imperative
back to
because you are
war
often
by
in
something
danger of
less
getting
than
mauled by
real.
demons when trying to do them. And if you simply clear out enemies beforehand, you're basically losing most of the time game. The left is hammer. Take Master would continue to optimize strategies, along with creating many of his own.
Are you
he would
awake
begin
yet,
to
Jack?
Scrape the bottom of the barrel of ancient knowledge.
GW,
On
the Arsenal
13th of
AI
March
is corrupted
2015,
beyond
he would
repair.
achieve a
I
time
admit
of
that I
20:32.
underestimated you.
On map 29, he implemented a precise rocket jump that was discovered 15 years earlier. And on the chasm, he used the extremely precise
I'll
wall run to
squeeze
cross
the
top
answers
of
out of
the
you
pool
instead,
before the
my
end, therefore
son.
skipping over the complex ledge section. Though it has to be said, despite incorporating this trick, he still wasn't able to match Looper's time at that stage. Looper had spent far too many years grinding the ledges, and even in full game runs was able to traverse them effortlessly. After
What do
5
you
more
hope to
months of
hear?
practice,
You know he
Zero
doesn't know
Master would
anything.
submit the first
It's
run
not him
in no below
I want
20
the
minutes,
answers
with
from.
a run of 19:59. This essentially used the same strategies as his previous submission, but his overall technique had been steadily improving. 2016 saw the entry of the Australian runner Elim with a time of 19:51. Like Zero Master, Elim began Doom speedrunning in 2014 after witnessing Dime's run of Plutonia at Awesome Games Done Quick. Elim had spent a lot of time grinding Doom 2, but wasn't quite able to push through to the top spot until this point. Elim wasn't known for revolutionizing the way the game is played, but his hard work ethic allowed him to cultivate his skill enough to challenge even the best players. Being stripped of his record, Zero Master came back strong, achieving a 1936 in 2016 and a 1928 mark. By this point, the amount of time that could be saved by his strategies was dwindling dramatically. Though nothing close to what had been seen, but surprisingly, Surprisingly,
Good work,
even
Jack.
20 years
This is
after
where
the
it
game
gets
was released,
interesting.
game-changing mechanics were still lying in wait to be discovered. In July of 2017, Zero Master finds a brand new exploit, which will become known as the Zero Press. This new technique it's even worse through the walls. This is a drastic shift in routing based on level. On map 15, a Zero Press can be used to quickly activate the key. Previously, players would have to navigate multiple obstacles to the very top of a building in order to reach that same switch, which can now be hit
Do
from
you remember
outside.
this place?
Because Doom isn't technically 3D,
Of course.
you can hit the switch from far below.
This is where we
the
first
ground
met.
level. The fact that the blue
I
key
remember
card is so
now.
long to collect is why before this
Today
technique was
is the
found,
day I met
speedrunners
you.
would use the secret exit and go through map
That's
31,
it.
the secret level. This ended up being faster, even with the extra map. Now, players could reach the normal exit much quicker, and therefore skip map 31 entirely. On map 17, you could hit the switch behind the yellow keycard door from the outside, through the wall. This meant that you could skip the yellow key, saving at least 30
I think I
seconds.
found something to
Using
pass
this new
along to
Zero
the
Press,
future.
Zero
What?
Master took the record below 19
He said
minutes,
all living
18
things
to
want their
From here,
genes to live
most
on.
known strategies
Are you
were
talking
already
about the
being
baby?
implemented. Slight
Yeah.
variation saving at most
The
18
genes aren't the
seconds.
only thing you pass on.
But
There are
players
too many
knew
things
the
that
main
aren't
way
written
to
into our
make the going
DNA.
lower was by
It's up to
refining the
us
existing
to teach that
techniques
to our
and making
children.
sure their mechanics
What
were
kind of
rock solid.
things?
Over the next
About the
few years,
environment,
a three-way
our
battle
ideas,
ensued
our
between
culture,
Luther, Zero Master,
poetry,
and Elid, with each player
compassion,
exchanging blows.
sorrow,
By February
joy.
2020,
We'll tell them
Elid
everything
lost
together.
18-17.
Is that
With
a
the 18-minute
proposal?
barrier looming ahead, the
This
question
is
was,
for
who
your
would be the one
ears
to destroy it?
only.
May of 2020, it was Luca who eventually decided to take the initiative to grind for the first 17-minute run. And best of all, he would stream his attempts on Twitch, which I have to say is relatively rare for Doom speedrunning. In June, several weeks into attempts, he would take back the record with an 1812. In July, he would cut it down again to 1806. August would see another 2 seconds shaved off. On September 10th, coming into the second to last map, he was 8 seconds ahead of his 1804. But some unlucky pathing with a Kako demon cost him barely enough time to put the milestone in doubt. After 4 entire months of grinding, with a personal best of 18 flat, the task seemed to take much longer than anticipated. But finally, on the 26th of September 2020, Lupa would achieve this run.
Am I full of sorrow? Am I hurt and pain? Or am I filled with love? I walk by myself on the streets below and ask every child I know, do you think tomorrow will bring sun or rain? Which one of these will show? I can't say goodbye to yesterday, my friend. I keep holding on till the end. Out of the darkness, there is no other way than the light leading to yesterday.
Spurred on once again by the competition, Luca began streaming again in January
In
to
a
fight back. After tinkering
peace
with
not
his control
war,
settings and upgrading his
and
computer and monitor,
dreams
Luca
that
felt
I
better
let
than ever. No
slip
longer restrained by the
away,
looming possibility of breaking a new barrier,
I'll
he went on a tear.
find
Over a
the
3-week period, he lowered the
joyfulness
record a total
I'm
of 4
looking
times,
for
landing at a 17:29
way
on the 11th
back
of
in
February 2021. And this is where the record stands today. The Doom 2 full game speedrun had gone from a time of 1 hour and 10 minutes in 1995 to just under 17 and a half minutes over a span of 25 years. I must say, I had an absolute blast going back in time once again to learn more about the history of Doom speedrunning. Of course, there are still many more stories to be told, and I hope you can join me when we make this trip down memory lane again in the future. Now, a huge shout out to the Doom speedrunners who are always happy to answer my questions. If you are thinking about speedrunning Doom, I will put a link to the Doom speedrunning Discord in the description, and I really recommend it. As always, thank you so much for watching Legend. I hope you are having a fantastic day, and we'll see you in the next video.
Why can't each of us in the world ever see the best things
Quick,
in life
done, quick.
are
In the late 90s,
free?
these three words were almost synonymous with the
Little
word speedrunning. While id
sounds
Software's
of
predecessor
laughter,
Doom may have given birth
a
to
warm
speedrunning as we know it
hug,
today,
a
it was
smile,
Quake that thrust it into
a
the mainstream. But what
kiss
was
from
once the shining star of
you
speedrunning,
to
Quake eventually faded in
me.
popularity. With franchises
I
such as
fall
Mario and
to
Zelda
my
down,
knees,
Quake
I cry and I cry. Love, do not pass me by. Happy ever after, please stay for a while. Make time refuse to fly. I can't say goodbye to yesterday, my friend, 'cause I know how good it has been. Facing forever, here I stand, come what may. Bring the old, bring the new, yesterday. It's there that I'll find inner peace, not war, and dreams that I let slip away. I'll find the joyfulness I'm looking for way back in yesterday.
By 1996, Doom had already established a pretty active speedrunning community. Naturally, with Quake being the next release from id Software, people were already excited about continuing that tradition and pushing the new game to its limits. Quake carried over a couple of very important features from Doom. The first was the end screen that showed the time in which the level was completed. This made real-time score tracking a breeze and begged for competition to see who could complete each level in the lowest time. The second was the ability to immortalize runs by capturing influence from story never performed demos. These demos could be sent quickly over the internet or played back on any computer with Quake installed. Demos are amazing, and it's pretty awesome to be able to watch runs that are over 20 years old with such clarity. In the 90s, capturing videos from consoles was actually pretty difficult due to the resulting quality. Video files are much larger than demo files. Because most internet users were on dial-up and wanted to keep file sizes small, videos were compressed to such an extent that their quality suffered tremendously. For example, take a look at the speedrunning footage of GoldenEye 007 from 1999. Now, take a look at a Quake speedrun from 1997, 2 years earlier. In early 1997, the Quake speedrunners decided to work together to create a segmented speedrun of the entire game, all 4 episodes on Nightmare difficulty. In a standard speedrun person-player game, start to finish in a single attempt. In a segmented speedrun, a person, or even several people, will replay each level many times to get the optimal run and then piece them all together. The first segmented speedrun completed Quake in a time of 19 minutes and 49 seconds. The demo for this speedrun was converted into a video file and released under the title Quake Done Quick in June of 1997. Quake Done Quick would garner massive popularity and widespread attention. Anyone who was a gamer in the late 90s knew of Quake speedrunning. even if they had no idea what speedrunning was, or what it was even called. And to be perfectly